Media is made to move us. Some stories fall flat with characters we simply do not or cannot care about. Some move us with a focus on fleshed-out people who we can feel for and empathize with. Some even make us feel white-hot rage with even the most one-note depictions of evil. However, does a story having dynamic characters alone automatically make it good? And does having only one personality trait make a character and its story, therefore, bad? What even is the difference between a good and bad story, a good and bad character, and a good and bad person? The difference between the three seems to be a large point of contention for many new gamers and cinemaphiles alike. Just being someone you hate does not make a character automatically bad, just like how being the story's protagonist does not automatically mean someone is a hero, no matter how much said character might disagree. Mouthwashing is a single-player narrative adventure game that plays more like a visual novel created by Wrong Organ. Though not having many other games under their belt, Mouthwashing has skyrocketed to popularity and has even been nominated for Game of the Year in the Indie Game Awards. While the blurbification of the cast can at times be to the story's detriment, and being an actually meaningful and impactful piece of art that is, not as age-restricted as it should be for its themes and visuals. Of course, it would be one really nice fan cam edit to Imogen Heap's headlock away from virality. From a compelling yet heartbreaking story to a cast of characters written as people as opposed to stereotypes that an audience can easily latch onto, it is understandable that, just like that minty fresh flavor, this game is stuck on a lot of people's tongues. However, the characters we love aren't actually what makes us so fascinated with Mouthwashing. The characters we love aren't even the main point of the story. No, that honor goes to one Jimmy Z. A character that is incredibly hated for his horrible actions and self-assigned victimhood in every situation that he creates. There is so much to say about him that it is admittedly difficult to decide where to begin. The fandom's handling of him, which is hatred to a nigh-comical degree that begins to detract from the gravity of his actions. His own final attempt at redemption that ultimately goes to show how truly selfish he is. The ease of which he manipulates those around him. Perhaps the best place to begin may be to simply describe him as a person, which, when players are initially in the pilot's chair, often seems to be an incredibly well-written, hateable character. However, after taking time to digest the story's contents, it becomes clear that Jimmy himself is just okay. And it is the framing of the story around him that makes us truly hate his guts. He himself is one note, and that note of inability to take responsibility is the entire theme of the narrative. Jimmy is nothing special to write home about. He never was in his life, and even as a vile protagonist, he still isn't. Much more interesting, however, is the way in which our story's ex-Captain Curly, who has arguably even less characteristics and personality, is so beloved. So, let us delve into specifically why Jimmy here is so detestable, and why so many seem to adore and even absolve our disfigured captain of his sins. Or, more specifically, let us explore why such an easily hateable character serves to elevate each other character around them. This video, of course, is going to contain spoilers for the game Mouthwashing. If you want to, feel free to pause the video here and come back after you've played the game. If you are going into this game blind, please be advised that this discussion will include mentions of pregnancy, mental and physical abuse, manipulation, cannibalism, forced auto-cannibalism, and, of course, Jimmy. Viewer discretion is advised. In the quickest of recaps, Mouthwashing is a story of a man who crashes the Pony Express's Tulper long-haul space freighter he co-pilots in an attempt to cover up a heinous act that he has committed. With the captain incapacitated, we play as the newly self-appointed Captain Jimmy as he continues to make all the wrong choices and leads each crew member to their demise, all while lamenting that he always has to fix everything and that he is the only capable person on board. As you may have guessed, this is far from the case. The best way to describe Jimmy is as an absolute and total loser. He's lame. He's the type of person who volunteers to play the victim for sympathy points, to which audiences can only shake their heads and reply, "All your life." There is so much to be said about him that it would be very easy to just rant and rave at his expense. So, to save you from that fate, let us break down his horrible traits piece by piece to make this as easily digestible as Curly's leg meat. The first thing you may notice about Jim is his glaring inferiority complex. We see it clearly in the game's first conversation between him and Captain Curly. He takes Curly's congratulation of how well he's adjusting to life as a pilot as a slight, saying how annoying he finds everyone's admiration for their leader, while not passing up the opportunity to make it a confrontation, where the discussion may seem like one concerned friend talking to another about how apprehensive they seem. Jimmy uses it as a chance to lament about still being far below him. If Curly is worried if he's on the right path as a successful captain, how should he, a co-pilot barely scraping by in his new position, feel? It is offensive to him that someone so far above would even consider starting at the bottom as a choice, where he is forced by life to be there. That inferiority may have been compounded by a heavy dose of imposter syndrome, as it is implied that Curly is the one who got Jimmy's job at the Pony Express, meaning that his position of moderate power was only gifted to him on what may have felt like a whim. However, even with that being said, we can see his inferiority complex shine through most notably with his casual interactions surrounding Anya, interactions with reek of something between an incel and a failure of a nice guy. Anya is the nurse stationed on board the Topper freight ship. She doesn't have a full medical degree or license yet, but is paying her way through applications and entrance exams by working for the Pony Express, a company that did provide her with a rudimentary medical training course to make sure she was even eligible for the position. Unfortunately, due to her failing the entrance exam to get into medical school several times and the expenses that come with those failures, she has no leftover savings, something that we know for a fact she and Jim have in common. And yet, we are shown that Anya is actually an amazing nurse in spite of what we are told by Jimmy. The first introduction we have to Anya as a character is with her inability to give the severely injured ex-Captain Curly his medication because of the choking sounds he makes. It hurts her heart, sure, but it seems to make her physically ill. On the surface, that does seem like an inept medical professional who is incapable of getting past personal hang-ups in order to treat a patient. But then, the audience must realize that this point in game takes place 2 months post-crash. 2 months of her tending to her burned and severely injured captain, of miraculously managing to keep a quadruple amputee who's missing a majority of his skin and eye and who has unknowable levels of head trauma alive, with the equivalent of school nurses' office supplies and opioids, all because of her meticulous attention to detail and knowledge as a would-be med student. 2 months of having to tend to a man who, as we learn later in the game, took no action for her when he found out about abuse she was facing at the hands of another crew member. By every meaning of the word, it is amazing that Curly has lived this long without succumbing to his injuries, infection, or shock. And the only person responsible for that is Anya. Perhaps the sound of Curly's suffering was a breaking point after 2 months straight. Perhaps, since we see the world through Jimmy's eyes, there was another reason Anya wanted him to do it that we do not see due to his own preconceived notions of her. He needs to feel important and useful. Perhaps she put on an act to give him something simple yet important to do. Or perhaps Anya's behavior is just the result of unreliable narration. After all, that would go to show Jimmy's manipulative nature of not only the crew, as we see later, but of us as viewers of the story through his lens. Just as he did when Curly was captain, he equates the position with power. The same way we learned during the birthday scene that he saw Curly as looking down on him and everyone else simply for being the captain and in a position of power. Once Jimmy was placed into that role, he began looking down on the others in the same assumed way. Except he has no leadership skills like Curly did. He has no talents. He has no redeeming traits. He is a power-hungry man who wants others to respect him, and when one equates respect with control, you will tend to control others in whatever way you deem fit. Jim sees Anya as an incapable weakling who needs him to save her. He sees the absolute worst in every action of hers, while staunchly ignoring any success she has, or even misattributing it to one of the other male crew members, or even himself, as we most notably see with her quote of, "I have to believe our worst moments don't make us monsters," being misattributed by him to Captain Curly. That is why he doesn't even spare a second thought about us we are in whatever ways he wants. Once he got an iota of power as co-pilot, he likely began taking his own insecurities out on the easiest target. Whether fueled by misogyny or just Anya being the least likely to retaliate with her meek personality, she became that easy target to assert his superiority over. One thing we see happen quite often throughout the narrative is that James projects himself onto others, whether he likes them or hates them. He projects the potential that he wishes he had onto Daisuke, a young and charismatic boy with his whole life ahead of him, striving to make his way to make his parents proud, resulting in lip service about hoping he does better and talk of his future while inevitably unable to resist the urge to guide him down the wrong path through manipulating the young and impressionable man into doing something dangerous and ultimately deadly. On the other hand, Anya is by nature a more demure and shy woman, but she is a woman with undeniable talent for her craft. Instead of projecting the potential positives of himself onto her as he does with Daisuke, he seems to use her as an avatar for his own self-hatred. Jimmy projects his inability to do anything or succeed onto her, even when anyone can see the opposite truth. Perhaps at the beginning of their journey he felt justified in it, just seeing her as a pencil pusher playing psych and bothering him, giving him the right to make inappropriate jokes at her expense when they're alone. However, after the crash and her handling of Curly's injuries, he would be faced with the truth he simply refuses to accept. This woman who he has taken advantage of and taken his anger out on, this woman who he has ensured has had a worse time of it than himself, who he sees as the #1 poor baby in the world, still keeps her head held fairly high. When he sees that Anya is not as defeated by her life situations as he is, and that she keeps trying in spite of her circumstances, it makes him mad. After all, if you begin to see someone as little more than an amalgamation of your own worst attributes, and they are still better than you, that is infuriating. That is evil. To a man like Jimmy, that's worthy of punishment. Or, at the very least, it's worth asserting your dominance over. Jimmy's rear of Anya works to substantiate this. There is an argument some in the fandom make that he did not rear her and that her reactions could come from physical or emotional abuse within a consensual relationship. But that seems more than a bit reductive to the many arrows pointing toward rear within the story and its overall themes for it to be the case. With that being said, though, allow me to explain why this essay looks at the story with the assumption of rear in mind. One could very well take Anya's comment in the cockpit of, "I knew you would never give me the gun to protect myself from him, so I had to make sure that he would never be able to use it," to imply physical abuse, yes. But to be that terrified, coupled with the earlier discussion that she had with Curly regarding the lack of locks on sleeping quarter doors, coupled with the social harassment Anya confesses to Curly about when trying to fulfill his psych evaluations that Jimmy seems not too keen on the other guys hearing, mixed with the heavy emphasis the story puts on childbirth in terms of taking responsibility, just seems to point towards Wazlushka. Additionally, if their relationship was consensual but still a bit sweet, why would Jim bring up potential legal trouble waiting for him and the captain once they got off the ship? By this point in the story, we know that the Pony Express has gone under, dead and defunct, and only existent as a name to slap on their final paycheck once the Topper returns home. There wouldn't be any risk of being reprimanded or fired by upper management for a forbidden office romance. Maybe the company would try to dock their paychecks for it, but that doesn't equate a legal issue. And honestly, our co-pilot James does not strike me as the type of man to have any qualms about abandoning his baby mama with his child, or just refusing to pay child support. They're both broke and without any prospects when they return to Earth, and even family court lawyers require money. If the pregnancy existing and Jim not wanting to be a father were the only issues, then so what? In the harsh world all crew lives in, there is no doubt that Anya would just be seen as some chick who got herself knocked up while on the job, and that is no issue to the world at large. There are plenty of abusive relationships on Earth, so if Anya suddenly alleged that he was physically or emotionally abusive as a partner after coming home with a new baby, it likely wouldn't have that much impact. Through extra material, we learn that Jimmy has no real friends or family to speak of aside from Curly, so it would not even be a case of worrying about upholding a reputation. Though, even if he did have to worry about how his loved ones would react, it is doubtful that would be enough of a reason to kill himself and everyone else on board the Topper before his child could be born, as opposed to using his manipulation skills to get everyone on his side. The only logical reason to be worried about the pregnancy and the legal trouble Jimmy, and by extension the captain who let it happen on board, might face would be if said pregnancy happened due to an illegal act. Mixed with Anya's apprehension to drink anything that could make her slightly inebriated with Jimmy around, and his ability to essentially roofie Swansea, matched with the fact that we as viewers know he has already been in legal trouble in the past, 2 cases of physical assault, might not prevent him from finding other similar work in the future, but potentially being labeled as a sex offender likely would. The only job he could find with the severity of his existing criminal record, a job that was given to him by a friend, would be out of his reach. Jim would lose whatever life he had and whatever potential life he could make because of his own choices, with the physical manifestation of said bad choices a la a baby. He would be unable to shift blame to another person. As soon as Anya told him about the pregnancy, our resident pessimist and nihilist James already decided his life was over. He already decided that those around him should suffer the same fate. Let this be remembered as a tragedy. Jimmy blatantly told Curly his plans, yet the captain still gave him access to the cockpit. Did he not take him seriously? Did he not think his friend was truly that unstable after learning of his crimes against Anya? Did he simply not understand, or was Curly just acting oblivious with the hopes that ignoring the problem would return things to the status quo? We'll return to our ex-captain in just a bit, so put a pin in that idea for now. The psychology of Anya is in itself a disturbing yet intriguing thing, with the main takeaway being that oftentimes, it is more about asserting power over others than gaining pleasure. It is about exercising your control over someone in environments that make entitlement, toxic masculinity, and unequal gender norms a cornerstone. To quote a Frontiers in Psychology article, hypermasculinity and toxic masculinity are associated with insecurities, hypersensitivity, distrust towards women, and satisfaction obtained from controlling and dominating women. Jimmy is a perfect poster boy for exuding toxic masculinity in an attempt to mask his insecurities with each "I'll handle it" or refusal to let anyone else on board be right. Jim does not love or even remotely like Anya, and that is why he belittles and abuses her. He hates every part of himself that he thinks he sees in her until they're is a part of him in her. Whether subconsciously or not, he wanted his assumptions and hatred of her to be true. When she tells him of her pregnancy, and his reaction is neutral, in all likelihood that's because he succeeded. He won in his mind. Even if he still has very thinly veiled insecurities about her, he has successfully brought her down to his level. No. Worse, he has forced her to something below him. Something he has marked and dominated. To the bitter end, he is never sorry for what he does or has done to Anya. Being the captain, being the one who fixes and takes care of things, makes him feel like he can finally do something. Like he's the big manly man who has his act together. And in his psychotic break fantasies, who is it that praises him the most? Who is it that strokes his ego? It is a power fantasy for him to have Anya truly see him as her captain. However, when he's not hopped up on the fantasy of being someone everyone can look up to and rely on, Jimmy tends to devolve into a poor, pitiful me outlook on life. We can see this illustrated nicely within extra content provided by Wrong Organ within their Steam Q&A threads. For example, as stated earlier, we learned within the game that both Jim and Anya have no savings to speak of, but the hobbies written within the Q&As are so fitting. Anya spends most of her free time studying medicine, but when she can, she goes on runs to clear her mind, or binges horrible reality TV when at her lowest lows. Jimmy, on the other hand, in his ever-defeatist attitude, believes that hobbies are for people who can afford them. He does weightlifting, and nothing more. But as you know, there are always ways to entertain yourself, even if you do not have money. You can still write, you can still draw, you can do a number of things with very little capital. It may be an instance of the man simply rathering to wallow in his own self-pity when unable to participate in the lavish holidays Curly enjoys, then try to find something he truly likes, instead opting to do the one thing that he believes will help him attain control: get stronger. There is another comparison to be made between our dear captains here, as Curly's main hobby is also stated to be weightlifting, though spending time with family and loved ones is his second favorite activity that again contrasts with Jimmy's life. One does have to wonder where the co-pilot's family is. Does he have any relatives left alive? Or is he left alone for the sheer fact that he is an insufferable man who nobody would choose to spend time with? His desire to seem put together and strong, sort of like a child putting on his father's shoes and pretending to go to work, is seen throughout the game. Nobody in the crew really sees Jimmy as a competent leader, but who else can they turn to? They have all been told by Jim that their beloved captain tried to steer them into the asteroid, literally switching their places within the narrative and painting himself as the hero who stepped up to fix Curly's mess. Quite literally, from the beginning of the game, we, as players, are being manipulated by Jimmy in exactly the same way as the rest of the crew. He manipulated Curly before the crash, at the very least, instilling a seed of doubt in his mind that the pregnancy truly was both of their faults, instead of the blame lying squarely on the rapist's shoulders, resulting in the captain giving him free range over the ship's controls in what could be seen as his moment of weakness. He manipulates Daisuke by preying on his youthful trust of authority and ultimately gets him gravely injured. He doesn't see Anya as enough of a person to try manipulating her consciously, but the fear he appears to instill in her is used to his advantage throughout the game's events. When he can't successfully manipulate Swansea into trusting him or believing he is capable in the events leading up to and after Daisuke's day, he falls back on his most irritating character trait of all. His mentality of victimhood is his biggest barrier of protection from the world around him. Nothing can ever be his fault because he isn't the one who puts actions into motion, except for the fact that he is. Yet, Jimmy's mental gymnastics reach literally delusional levels when the pressure gets too high. Remember, the entire reason he set the ship on a collision course was because he feared Anya enough to impregnate her, and he did not want to be held responsible or be forced to face the reality that his actions were his own. This is why he manipulates Curly into believing they would all be punished if they returned, even with the Pony Express shutting down. But because Curly is a self-proclaimed big-picture kind of guy, and without a brain or spine, his friend's words gave him pause. He was taken in by the assurance that Jimmy would make things right, and they all die because of it. But it's not Jimmy's fault that any of this happened. It's Curly's fault for not being a better captain. And of course it's not his fault for fearing Anya, since he sees her as less than human and thus sees there is no fault in anything that happens to her. Nor is it his fault that Daisuke dies. Sure, he pressured the kid into crawling through what's akin to an active garbage disposal to get to the locked medbay instead of doing it himself, but Daisuke was the one who was clumsy enough to let himself get hurt. Not to mention that Jimmy surely could have found a way to patch him up if Swansea hadn't decided to put the kid out of his misery. Who cares if he doesn't even know how to do something as simple as staunching a gushing wound? Even without Anya, he's the captain, so he would have been fine. Forget the fact that he did nothing to even try stopping the man he literally just poisoned into a temporary coma from crushing the kid's skull in with an axe. And who could forget the ship's mechanic himself? His death was none other than his own fault. There is an argument to be made whether the cockpit axe attack scene was real or entirely in Jimmy's head. The same argument can be made for whether Swansea being tied to the chair and executed was real, or whether that part was the beginnings of his psychotic hallucinations melding with reality. Now, based entirely on the analyticism seen in each hallucination or break from reality, and the behaviors we know Jimmy has lending themselves more towards acting out emotionally and then rationalizing his decisions later, the idea of Swansea charging at him with malicious glee seems farther in the camp of Jim fabricating reality than the truth. Sure, it is believable that Swansea may have chased him down if he believed that an observably unstable man like Jimmy was going for the captain's gun. After all, it is highly doubtful Curly advertised to the crew that it was missing. Looking at the setup of the scene, Jimmy very well may have been going to look for it. Hell, he may have even been chased into the cockpit at some point to put the fear of God into him after finding out what Jim did to Anya. Being that we only ever see the two of them talking alone after the accident. But ultimately, Jimmy is the type to judge others by his own thoughts and actions. When he sees the singular cryopod, his assumption, and the only thought he will allow Daisuke to humor, is that Swansea was hiding it from everyone to keep for himself after the others had died off, either due to hunger or infighting. He staunchly refuses to even consider that Swansea actually did clean out and fix one of the pods, that he was doing his job during the time he ordered Daisuke to quintuple check their inventory, and cannot fathom the man doing something like hiding the pod for another's sake. Seeing the way Swansea treats Daisuke at the end, and knowing he is a father who makes up any excuse he can to see his adult children and cook for them, it is not out of character whatsoever for him to have planned on tricking Daisuke into getting into the pod to save his life. At least, before finding out about Anya's pregnancy. After that point, it seems likely that he would force her to get into the pod so that she and her baby would have a chance at life, even if her feelings on the matter were in direct contrast. However, because James is a lout who would sell anyone up the river first chance he got, he uses the pods as leverage for himself to feel better about killing Swansea once he does find the gun. Ultimately, the only reason Jim has his pseudo-come-to-Jesus moment is because Swansea is the only one able to call him out for being a scummy coward of a man who can only think of himself. Nobody ever wanted to tell him to his face when things were still semi-functional and there was the slightest hope of salvation, but by then, when their supplies were dwindled to nothing, 2 out of 5 of their crew were dead, and he was tied to a chair, facing down the barrel of his death. He had no reason not to speak his mind. No doubt Jimmy would have used the cryopod to save himself, if not for their conversation. The choice to save Curly was one made out of defiance. One last act to prove to the now dead elder who actually did know better that he was not the fuck-up he claimed him to be. He's just a poor man thrust into an impossible situation, a man who made an impossible choice, and by mere happenstance had everything go wrong for him. Sure, he made a few wrong choices here and there, but What else was he to do? It's not as though he was the cause of the tragedy, since his maligned soul is the center of the universe and an anchor for sorrow. He has no choice but to finally take responsibility for the universe's actions, and he sees himself out. Truly, our Captain Jimmy is a hero in the end, made by his own hand. Jimmy is a man who has to feed his own ego. Because he sees himself as a victim of life, he tries his best to laud himself as a collected and capable man in spite of his situation. Someone who rises from the ashes of circumstance like a phoenix, so to speak. However, that creates a cognitive dissonance when faced with the fact that he is, in fact, not this competent and adept leader. He has to deflect blame elsewhere in order to preserve his own psyche, and when he's unable, it results in a mental break that causes him to act even more brashly. It creates a disconnect between true reality and Jimmy's reality. A mental break that was a long time coming, as we can see even in the beginning of the game. Perhaps it is avant-garde, but the unreality segments of the game smack of what Jimmy is experiencing mentally as portrayed through visual metaphor. When he's finally unable to shift blame onto anyone else, mainly due to a stark lack of living crewmates around to blame for future missteps, he gives up. He creates a new self that he can blame while simultaneously deifying Curly in the process. We must remember that by this point of the game, none of the dialogue we see from Curly is actually his own. It is all in Jimmy's mind. Every wise anecdote, every bit of chastising, and even saying that he'll take on the burden of playing the villain for Jimmy's sake. It is all Jim putting the friend that he has crippled on a pedestal. The version of Curly on fire literally shows him as not only a manifestation of the one and only wrong Jim can accept, but also puts the man as a guiding light in the vast darkness. Even as he is taunted by Polly in the very end, he is still levitating the old captain to a godly position that, in truth, he does not deserve. If only he could live up to this imagined wise version of his friend, this all-knowing man who would surely have known what to do, then he could have been a good captain. He falls to his knees as he begs Curly to forgive and absolve him of the sins he committed that led to ruin, while still refusing to comprehend the fact that this all began because of actions he took long prior. This was the result of his dehumanization and brutalization of their nurse. This all happened because he felt entitled to her, just as he does to everything else. And that sense of entitlement sticks with him until he poor pitiful me's all the way to killing himself. True to Swansea's word, Jim is a coward who ran away from his duties until the very end. There is still work he could have done after freezing Curly. He could have looked for resources on board to fix the ship. He could have even tried emptying out the cockpit goop enough to see if steering was at all possible. Curly would have been safe in his stasis pod even if the cockpit, a chamber purposefully placed behind multiple airlocks for this exact reason, was breached. But that would never be possible for Jimmy. He is a pessimist and a defeatist at heart, which means that yes, with the death of Swansea and even Daisuke, the thought of trying to literally fix anything himself would never occur to the man. More than that though, trying to fix anything would mean actually admitting his own fault. The possibility of dying while doing something actually heroic or useful is nowhere near as comforting as the security of going out on your own terms. Even as he places Curly into the cryopod, he says that he was trying to save them both, still clinging on to the story he tells himself that death would have been better salvation than having to deal with the consequences of his own actions. His performative admittance of fault to the mental approximation he created of Curly was just that. An act. One designed solely to make himself feel better after every tragedy he caused. In the end, James still failed to take responsibility for anything. Jimmy is so easily hateable because over and over and over again he makes the worst possible choices while centering himself as a hapless and helpless bystander. He was designed to match the easiest tropes to make us as an audience despise him. A man unable to make any change, even though he ultimately did have all the power as captain on the ship. Everyone had to look to him for guidance, but honestly, with all his assertions that Curly was some incredible captain, the way he continuously snubbed the man for being good at his job and used it as leverage vis-a-vis, oh, you're so well respected and beloved, meanwhile, we're just scum beneath your boot, must be nice to look down on us all. While the truth of the matter is that Curly was an okay captain at best, but when compared to Jimmy, it truly would have been great. Some infer through the character dynamics seen within the game that Jimmy joined the Tulper crew sometime after Curly, Swansea, Anya began working together. And while that is unconfirmed and unknown, we as players do know that the two men have a deep connection. Though we don't know exactly how long they've been friends before beginning to work together, they were at the very least close enough for Curly to trust Jimmy enough for a personal recommendation to the Pony Express, and for Jimmy to see them as a pair fighting together against the world. A bit ironic when you realize that the Pony Express is named after a real-life mail company that used to employ orphans to deliver mail in dangerous conditions, having them work under the assumption that nobody would miss them if they died. Maybe they met at the gym while lifting. Maybe they were friends from school or even childhood. All we know for certain is that Curly valued his opinion more than anyone else's when it came to operations and how he himself is viewed. Above all else, Curly is a notorious people-pleaser. He doesn't want friction in his crew, and he will take on work that is below his station if that means there will be less conflict between his crew members. Now, that can be seen as a nice quality in a leader, someone who is not too stuck up in his own rank to be willing to lend a hand, but not when done the way Curly does it. Aiding and picking up slack is one thing, yes, but there is a reason that psych evaluations are done by the trained on-ship medical professional and not done by one friend to another. The comments Jimmy made to Anya during his past evaluation were inappropriate, and with the proper background knowledge could even be seen as taunting to what he had done to her soon after boarding the ship. It is harassment at the very least from an HR perspective, but the proper way to handle the situation would have been to reprimand Jimmy for not taking his evaluation seriously, not to do Anya's job for her. By doing the evaluation himself to avoid hurting his friend's feelings or, gasp, risking Jimmy being mad at him, Curly risks taking down false information, which we even see Curly filling in answers for him by the end by saying, I'll mark that one down as good, and it does nothing to address the real issue or source of conflict. It treats the symptoms, but not the disease. At this point in the story, Curly likely knows nothing about the assault. It occurs days before Anya's first attempt to tell him, in fact. Granted, it was an attempt that Curly seems to misinterpret, as he seems to do with any conversation that is not 100% literal. But the choice he makes here is the beginning of the downfall of everything. We see this pattern set in place each time Curly tries to settle anything with his crew. Instead of following regulations made to keep people safe, Curly ignores the rules to keep his crew as happy, or at the very least as functional as he can, even when that means leaving a dangerous tool like the axe out of storage and in Swansea's care for a just-in-case reasoning. Even if that means doing nothing when Anya tells him in as blunt a way that she can muster that Jimmy hurt her, and that it resulted in pregnancy. From her perspective, she has already tried telling him subtly that something was going on when she brought up the lack of bedroom locks. She knows from his personality that Curly would never give her the gun to protect herself from him, and ultimately, she was right. What would you have done? With his big picture attitude, it seems like Curly took her first question as a simple curiosity, from the perspective of an optimist who might wonder why any room would need a lock instead of wondering why every room doesn't have one. Anya is distraught after having taken the captain's firearm and hidden it. Yet again, Curly misunderstands her devastation as simple stress. You were the only one who didn't get a psych evaluation. I should have thought of that, never thinking further than the obvious. The conversation following her admittance to hiding the gun is devastating. I'm pregnant. What? Who would you? Captain, I told you. I've known him for a long time. I'll talk to him. This implies one of two things. Anya either outright told Curly that Jimmy was, at the very least, making unwanted advances towards her sometime off screen, or that their earlier conversation finally clicked, and they instantly thought of Jimmy when considering who might have entered her room uninvited. Not only does Anya's devastation imply that Jim broke into her sleeping quarters enough times for her to not only consider, but know Curly wouldn't let her keep herself safe, but it outright states that she can only imagine what worse he might do to herself and possibly the rest of the crew if he ever took the firearm. After all, by this point, Jimmy has already committed one of the most heinous acts a human can do to another. What more can you worry about after someone repeatedly assaults you in your own bed under your captain's nose? He clearly did not need the gun to threaten or coerce her into accepting his advances. And we know by the end that Anya would rather die than be used by Jimmy, which leaves us to wonder why she fears him possessing the gun. Does she fear that he would torture her or kill the rest of the crew with it? Or does she think he might use it as a threat so that he could do the same thing he did to her to other members of the crew that he's taken an interest in depraved indifference? In the end, Curly decided to do nothing when first confronted with the knowledge that Jimmy would be Anya, deciding that monitoring the situation would be better than confronting his friend about the crime. Contrary to what people on TikTok would lead you to believe, there were options he could have taken to at least mitigate further damage. Nothing could ever undo the horrors done to Anya, but Curly could have permitted her to sleep in medical with a door that locked for her own comfort. He could have put Jimmy on what's akin to house arrest and confined him to his quarters for the remainder of the journey. He could have even used one of the cryostasis pods to keep him secure and away from the others for the remainder of the trip. As we see with the ex, doing Anya's work for her and even saying he would keep her assumed suicidal ideation off the records, this was not a matter of him being opposed to breaking regulation. This was Curly choosing to do nothing. This was at best a case of him dealing with decision paralysis and believing that if he hid his head in the sand it would somehow all wash away, or hoping things would remain at the status quo. At worst, this is a case of the captain rathering to let his friend, who he already knows has a history of run-ins with the law for violent crimes, continue his duties and continue having access to Anya unmitigated because, well, that's his friend. Surely the situation is a misunderstanding, or perhaps it's not as severe as she made it out to be. Perhaps it's a case of her changing her mind after the fact, or good old Jimmy just being too passionate and not knowing how to take a hint. Curly certainly doesn't. He decided to go check up on how his recipient friend feels after learning he got Anya pregnant, instead of staying to comfort her after telling him alone. He even reprimanded her for not waiting for him to be there with her to do it, even though by this point she has no reason to believe Curly wouldn't side with her as we were, since thus far that is all he's done through his inaction. In all likelihood, she didn't want to be proven right in that assumption, because from everything she has witnessed from her captain, he likely would lean toward a middle-of-the-road and ultimately more pro-Jimmy stance to try and keep the peace. Then his final and most detrimental choice cements everyone's fate when he allows himself to believe Jimmy about needing to take care of the problem his way. Perhaps he could have mistaken Jimmy's clear implications as a morbid joke, or even waxing poetic in a nihilistic way, but that in itself is no excuse to allow anyone into the cockpit when they have just told you to your face that instead of facing consequences once they get back home, the entire situation situation could be remembered as a tragedy. Curly has no business being shocked when he crashes the ship. Even with his observed inability to pick up on subtle social cues or understand hyperbole, Jim literally said he would take care of it in such a cryptic way. Perhaps, in that moment, he breathed the sigh of relief that Anya hid the gun away. Perhaps he thought Jimmy was having a serious breakdown, but never imagined he would be unhinged enough to crash the entire ship when confronted with the fact that the gun was gone. Every step of the way, Curly makes the wrong decision by either trying to keep the status quo at his own and others' expense, or in enabling Jimmy to continue his abuse by looking the other way. Make no mistake, he is complicit in any continued sweep Anya went through. He's not as guilty or bad as Jim because he's not a but he still did nothing to stop the tragedy that befell his ship when he could have done something. Everything is still Jimmy's fault, and we are not going to shift that blame anywhere else. But that does not make Curly entirely without it for the sin of sloth. Being a man who made bad choices, was negligent, and was cowardly in his own right, why is Curly not hated in the same way as Jimmy for roughly the same actions? Players of the game seem to like, or at the very least have sympathy for, Curly due to the extremely unique situation he is put in throughout the narrative. He has zero say over anything that happens. He is very literally objectified. Curly is touched without his consent, treated without his consent, fed and fed off of without his consent, and ultimately saved without having any say in his situation. All he can do in the end is watch Jimmy's every move, not even taking his remaining eye off of the man in the dark. To many players, Curly is not even a person. Due to his lack of dialogue, the fact that we don't see what he originally looked like till the very last possible moment in the game, and the fact that he has no autonomy, he is seen more as a prop. The fandom treats him as a mascot with the intellect of a puppy or small child, when in fact he is at the very least semi-cognizant throughout the narrative. In truth, Curly's situation is a mirror of Anya's. The way he's treated on screen is a different variation of how the nurse is brutalized and how her path, while on the tulpa, is dictated by the actions of others, just turned on its head, perverted, in the literal verb definition. Though with that being said, some speculate about whether Jimmy would have taken advantage of Curly in the same way he did Anya, looking at the symbolism of how we, as Jimmy, always look down at him in his bed, where he lays helpless, the same place Anya was at, as we infer from the bedroom lock discussion. It does not seem like that far off of an idea. Jim did beat Curly when giving him his medication during one of the first times, because just like Anya, he could not stomach the sounds of him choking on his pills or handle his pained squirming. And, just like she never brought up the lawsuit again until her breaking point, when her initial prodding fell on deaf ears, Curly never fights back or speaks out again. He can do nothing throughout the game but weep and laugh when Jimmy is at his lowest. Because of this objectified status and his inability to act, even when we sit in his POV at the game's very end, he is truly victimized in the way that Jimmy believes himself to be. On that note, many attribute Jim's lies to Curly's reality. You know, he was a good man put into an impossible situation, yada yada. It is true that he's not the sharpest tool in the shed, but that does not necessarily mean he's a himbo like many seem to headcanon. Yes, it is fun to draw him with big mommy milkers, but that is not the reason he misses Anya's point during their nighttime conversation. He isn't just too dumb to pick up on subtlety or anything of that sort. In truth, he fails to connect the dots due to being optimistic to a fault. A trait that is not as good as shoujo anime would have you believe. Curly's belief that being able to see the bigger picture, to be able to overlook something's minor faults for the majority bonus it brings, is a net positive. When doing a job as mentally draining as long-haul space travel, that can be a beneficial trait to possess, but not when coupled with viewing the world through rose-colored glasses and your opinion of a minor flaw in one person being life-ruining to another. Jimmy's a criminal. Everyone has their imperfections. Everyone deserves a second chance. He's a little rough around the edges, but I'm sure deep down he has a heart of gold because he's never treated me poorly, and I've never seen firsthand him doing it to others. He makes inappropriate jokes, but he's a hard worker. He keeps me centered and humble. He's not trying to make me feel lesser, right? On top of his lack of wit, because his character is arguably bland and we do get to play as him, Curly is easy for the player to insert themselves onto. He's not particularly introspective, but he does seem to genuinely care about his crew as a unit. No, that care for the whole is detrimental to specific people at different times. Viewers still tend to imprint on a nice yet lacking deuteragonist. Now, does this criticism mean Captain Curly should be entirely condemned? Not necessarily. We can observe that Jimmy is a bad influence on the man. That may sound like a foolish notion with them both being adults, but try to see it from this perspective. There is a phenomenon in schools where a good student is placed beside a troublemaker or class clown with the hope that one student's good traits will rub off on the other. Unfortunately, yet predictably, things never work out that way. The good student is usually reprimanded for the other child's misbehavior, and they ultimately start to pick up the bad mannerisms. That very well may be the case with these two, while also being an instance of opposites attract. Curly is the optimist to Jimmy's pessimist, so of course he wants what's best for him. He wants to believe the best of his friend. That creates its own disconnect within his mind. The desire for his friend to be a good person means that he innately tries to reframe anything he learns into that context. We already know that Jimmy lies with an incredible amount of ease. It's second nature to him. Without a doubt, he lied to Curly about his criminal record. It becomes a misunderstanding between him and the plaintiff, or the courts being rigged in favor of those with more money or better looks, or anything he can blame that is not within his control. Hell, it could even be what he truly believes when looking back at his aversion to take blame. The best told lies are the ones we ourselves believe, after all. So, when Jimmy does something newly bad on his ship, of course Curly would be confused and hesitant to believe it. He wants to believe in his friend, not only because that's his friend, but because accepting Anya's statement wholly in that instant would also mean accepting that he was lied to, as well as accepting that he did not know his friend the way that he thought he did. Of course, that does not mean it is a good excuse. However, it also doesn't mean that he doesn't believe what happened to Anya. It just means that he needed more time to think than he could afford, and that he likely would not have come to the correct conclusion, even if he did have all the time in the world to think it over. People tend to be very quick to say, well, you should always immediately trust and believe the victim, and yes, always believe but verify. However, humans are not that easy to reprogram. They have bonds and these disgusting things called emotions, and even though it hurts the victim most, hearing about someone you considered a very close friend doing something so vile should also feel like a betrayal. Curly, in that very imperative time, made the wrong choice, and his whole crew suffered for it. He may be a usually moral and upstanding citizen, but good men don't do nothing, and good men don't put the Rosui's feelings before the victims just for the sake of preserving friendships and workflow. There likely would have been a path to redemption and reconciliation for most everyone aboard the Tulper, but because the characters were fleshed out, or not fleshed out as they were, we would likely never get to see it, even if Curly did do the right thing. Jimmy could never be redeemed. Not simply because he is a heinous little man, but because he never saw his most horrid actions as wrong. Simply diverting blame is bad, and never accepting it when placed right in front of him as a visage of meat carved from his friend's and captain's form is worse. But just truly never understanding that there was blame to take because he felt entitled to what was not his, is the true source of his problems. Though he did say, yes, I messed up in the end, he never acknowledges anything specifically aside from hurting Curly. He barely feels regret for executing Swansea. He believed fully that Daisuke's death was not on his shoulders. And hell, he might not even see what he did as taking advantage of Anya. He's just as likely to have taken her silence or lack of a vehement enough no as an emphatic yes. Curly never got the chance to seek redemption as every part of his humanity was stripped away from him, not only by the crew, but by the audience as well. There may be hope for him if he's ever found and rehabilitated after being put in cryostasis, but if you have played Wrong Organ's other title, How Fish Are Made, you know that his fate is nothing to look forward to. Swansea was never able to take on the role of mentorship he realized just after it was too late may have healed his soul. If he had not been so quick to dismiss his protege, he may have had something to want to remain sober for. If he had not been so quick to turn back to an unhealthy coping mechanism once he realized hope was lost, he may have been able to do some more effective good at the very end. Perhaps he could have even imparted some street smarts onto his apprentice that would have prevented him from a horrible death. Daisuke had the chance to mature and grow up a bit from the kid he was, but had that chance stripped away from him by a man hungry for power. Understand that naivety is not in itself your fault, but not standing up for what you believe in maybe. Daisuke could have opposed Jimmy further. He expressed how bad an idea drugging Swansea was. He did not want to disobey his mentor and go into the vent, but because he did not want to be seen as a coward by his elder, and said elder knew that was a trait he could prey on, he abandoned his correctly better judgment and did what he was told. Anya, ironically, even though her Weaver saw himself as the story's victim who had no agency in life and could only react to the tragedies as they happened, she was the only one who actually had no say. In both literature and film, the term female agency refers to the ability of female characters to take action and make their own decisions that affect their lives and the outcomes in the text. For all intents and purposes, Anya had zero agency for the majority of Mouthwashing's duration. She was unable to change the downward trajectory of the Tolper crew's life, even in spite of her attempts to gentle parent her Nilias once he rose to power, and despite her mind always leading back to her duties. There are two main reasons this seemingly anti-woman thread was never really called out or latched onto by the fandom. The first being that nobody really has agency within the narrative. Not Daisuke, not Swansea, and certainly not Curly. They all have to act on Jimmy's, at times off-the-wall whims, and to their own detriment. The only character who has agency to speak of is a megalomaniac, unable to see his own flaws. The second reason is, to put it bluntly, because Anya ripped her agency from Jimmy's hands in her final living act. Whatever he had in mind for her, be that a punching bag, incubator, or scapegoat, it is her suicide that sets the end of the story in motion. An action Anya had no say in was what incited the story, and her death is what decided the end for everyone else. Her actions and arc are what move the narrative forward. If the story were from her perspective, she would make a fine hero. She is the one who experiences the hero's journey when her ordinary life is thrown into turmoil, when she gains an ally in Swansea after finally confiding in him what has happened, and when she experiences the dark night of the soul and resolution in her choice to take her life. No difficult to call it any kind of feminism. The fandom's fixation on making Anya this holy figure and precious baby who must be protected from everything has nicely distracted from the arguably brutal treatment she received throughout the story's run. It would be equally difficult to call her handling outright misogynistic either. This is a cautionary tale at its finest. A suicide where we as viewers don't even get to see more of her feelings and what ultimately drove her to choose that moment to take her own life, where we don't even get to see her final moments through Curly's eyes as he can only watch helplessly, followed by not even a shred of flavor text concerning her overdosed corpse, is more than a little bit anticlimactic. Yet, It makes perfect sense as a game presented from Jenny's perspective. He thinks so little of her that he barely cares about her death. Interestingly enough, an Easter egg throughout the game actually highlights this ambivalent attitude. Players can find the Pony Express ID cards of each crew member scattered about the ship. Most of the cards are damaged by the crash in some way or form, distorted, melted, and burned in ways that allude to their ultimate demise. Even Jenny's own card shows damage. However, the only card that is not damaged whatsoever is Anya's, which is left pristine. The easiest explanation as to why is because you can only find her card in the very beginning of the game when you play as Jimmy, setting the ship to crash. While that itself has meaning to dissect, again insinuating that she is in part what sets the story in motion, it works nicely as a visual metaphor for what Jimmy believes. Everything that happened to everyone else was in some part his doing, which takes physical form on their identification. But everything that happened to Anya is something she either deserved, brought upon herself, or did herself. Additionally, it could symbolize the part she played within the story. Nothing she does actively leads to the death of another, yet many die inadvertently because and for her. A narrative Cassandra, Curly decided to allow Jimmy his moment alone in the cockpit before he made good on creating his proposed tragedy. Jimmy pressured Daisuke into the vent under the guise of it being to rescue her, leading to his maiming by jagged metal and ultimate mercy killing by Swansea. Swansea, after killing Daisuke, is killed by Jimmy for allegedly attacking him in the cockpit, but Anya, she hides the gun specifically to prevent Jimmy from killing anyone with it, if anything postponing Swansea's death. She is clean and untouched in causing brutality, even if her efforts were thwarted in the end. Of course, the IDs could mean nothing, and the intent people ascribe to their states of disrepair could just be their own pedantic interpretations. Whatever the case, interpretation is what makes the characters and the story so impactful. It is nuanced, but doesn't insist upon itself. In part, it's due to the characters not being overwritten and, though falling into general tropes, not having those tropes envelop their entire being. Jimmy is a bad man, unequivocally so. Daisuke was a good kid who deserved more time. Swansea was a codger with a heart of ice, just waiting to be melted. Anya, someone who managed to remain forgiving and kind in spite of everything that happened to her, would have been a great doctor if she could only pass her entrance exam. But Curly, he's not a good man. He was not the best he could have been, but it's difficult to call him entirely bad either. If by some miracle he's found after the plot of Mouthwashing, then the life he lives post-Tolpor disaster will be his path to redemption. The memories he carries, the sins of his own and his co-pilot crawling on his back, and the physical reminders of what he could have prevented if he only listened and acted. That perspective growth, the fact that he has survived with the potential to do better in the future, is why so many still love our dear captain. And the fact that there is no possible reality in which Jimmy as we know him could ever have the same potential for growth is why we wish he died first. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. It took a lot of time and work to get all of this scripting and video put together, so I do hope that you like it. And as always, thank you very much to our wonderful Patreon members. We couldn't make this content without your support, so it truly does mean the world to us. At our brother, sibling, sister tier, we have Viri, Miss Mercurial, Box Kate, Inside Chaos, and Ash Valentine. At our mommies, daddies, and guardians tier, we have Kai and Mary. And at our gods, goddesses, and deities tier, we have gods and punks. Thank you so much, everybody, for getting to the end of this video. Thank you again for your support, and I hope to see you in another video. I'm Sister Anemone. I hope you have an absolutely blessed day, and, as always, I'll be praying for you.